Good afternoon to everyone. The title of my presentation is rather boringly The Importance of Advertising. It was quite snappily renamed by the AA here as Mad Men versus Maths Men. You can probably tell that I'm firmly in the Maths Men category. But what I intend to do today, basically, is to spend the first half of the presentation looking at my take on your industry. In the second half of the presentation, I'm going to look at what is actually a pretty major gap between the financial world and the advertising world and see how we can go about trying to bridge that gap. So, why am I here? Why am I qualified? What have I got to do with it? As was just mentioned, I'm the author of a report which you can see in the middle here, whilst there was an analyst at Deutsche Bank called The Importance of A&P. A&P, I should point out, is what consumer staples companies tend to call marketing or advertising as a whole. This is a report that I wanted to write and wanted to investigate because as we were coming out of the financial crisis and coming through the downturn, the consumer staples companies around the world took very, very different routes in terms of what they did with their advertising spend. There were some on one hand who cut spend, protected profitability, and continued with life until the recovery started to come through a bit stronger. There were those at the other end who actually continued to invest the way they'd always invested and didn't really change their habits very much given the external environment. And at that time, we didn't know what the right answer was, the right strategy, and I went about completely independently looking into whose strategy was better. I'll come on to that in a second, but it was picked up, first of all, by Marketing Week, it's on the right-hand side here, who featured it in the following week and wrote a whole cover section about it. And then, more importantly, as just been mentioned by Jeremy Bullmore, who wrote a fantastic summary of it for the WPP annual report. I'd encourage everyone to read it, much better than I could ever write about my own report. And snappily titled, Why a Ruritanian Poltergeist Can Be as Valuable as an Automated Processing Plant. It is a genuinely fantastic read, so hopefully you can take a look at that. So what did I do? What was in this note? Well, I took 35 of the largest European and US consumer staples companies in the world. When I refer to consumer staples, I'm talking food, beverage, tobacco, household and personal care. And I looked at data over 15 years, everything from volume growth to sales growth to profit margins, marketing spend, and analysed them over the course of about 3 months to see if I could find any patterns. And that 3 months' work basically came out with two charts. The first chart is pretty obvious. Higher advertising spend drives faster sales growth. Companies that increase their A&P to sales ratio delivered organic growth on average over this period of just over 6%. Companies that didn't grew by just 4.6%. It's 30% faster growth from the companies that continued to invest. And what may not be obvious immediately is that it wasn't just an aggregate result. This was actually faster growth every single year, with the exception of 2007. 2007, you may or may not remember, was a year which had a huge spike in commodity costs, price of grain, price of aluminium, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, the companies that grew the fastest were the ones that put their prices up the most. So higher advertising drives faster sales growth. Seems pretty obvious. But actually, the more interesting bit and the more impressive bit is that it also drives much faster profit growth. And in exactly the same data set, you can see here that the companies who increased their A&P to sales ratio grew their organic profits 50% faster than those that didn't. Now, again, the difference between 8.2% and 5.5% per annum probably doesn't sound like a lot. But for a consumer staples business, which is very long, slow, steady growth, that difference compounds over time to make quite a big difference. In earnings terms, over 5 years, you'd have a 20% difference. So what this says is that actually the faster sales growth, that is delivered by that higher advertising spend more than pays for itself in terms of profit growth. Absolutely vital. And that is why you've got a fantastic industry. But it's not just in aggregate that this data works as well. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Quite frankly, there's a whole load I could have chosen. Heineken, on the left-hand side of the screen here, very simply again, showing the A&P to sales ratio with their organic sales growth. The correlation here is just over 80%. So it's very clear when they spend more money, they drive faster top-line growth. The chart on the right-hand side here is P&G. Very similar, A&P to sales ratio and the organic volume growth this time. And you can see between basically 2004, 2009, as the rate of spend started to decelerate, so did P&G's volume growth. Now, I'm not going to try and tell P&G what they need to do, but when you look at that sort of correlation and that pattern, it seems pretty clear that if they want to get the top line going again, then it needs to be driven by higher advertising spend. So that's all being well, but why does Ash Park Capital care? Why am I here? Well, we're investors in consumer staples companies. Consumer staples companies make fantastic long-term investments because they've got fantastic brands that have been nurtured over a long period of time. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but you can see that if you bought 100 euros worth of consumer staples companies 25 years ago, they'd be worth 1,600 euros now, massively outperforming any emerging market, stock markets, massively outperforming the oil price, treasuries, gold, inflation, whatever you want to look at. None of them have been as impressive performers as consumer staples. So why is that? Well, I'm going to bring in a little bit of audience participation here, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask for shouts from the audience or even a show of hands or anything. But there's 21 brands up on that screen there. They're all owned by 21 different consumer staples companies. Some of them, like Colgate, are obvious, Dove, Unilever, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to give you a few seconds. Just have a look at those brands. There's 21 of them. They're owned by parent companies. Think about the parent company. Tot up in your head what you think the market value, the stock market value of these 21 companies might be. And I'll give you 5 or 6 seconds just to think about that. Okay, that's probably about 5 or 6 seconds. So I'm not going to ask what people thought, but if you're still in the billions, you're way out. The market value of these companies, as of last week, was $1.6 trillion. Now, why is that interesting? Well, if I ask you another question and say, if we exclude the intangible assets, if we exclude the brands, and we just look at the tangible assets of these companies, we look at the land, the buildings, the factories, the money that's owed to them, the money that they owe, etc., etc., and you tot all that up, what number do you think you come up to? Actually, the number is minus $66 million. So the tangible book value of these companies is negative. What does that mean? Well, it means, very simply, that the intangible value of this set is $1.7 trillion. Put that in perspective, because it's a big number, it's just short of the GDP of Canada or Australia. So more than all of the market value of these companies is intangible assets. What intangible assets do they have? Basically brands. So companies talk a lot about capital spend to renew factories, renew machinery, keep their tangible assets up to date. Companies talk a lot less about advertising spend, which is basically the equivalent for intangible assets, for brands. And to put it in context for the consumer staples companies, A&P spend on the intangibles is about 3.5 times that of capital spend, something that we hear very little about. Why is it that these brands are so valuable? Well, very simply, strong brands deliver revenue growth. We saw that earlier on. Revenue growth delivers gross margin expansion. Gross margin expansion delivers operating leverage through the profit and loss statement, allowing you to reinvest back into the brands and also a little bit down to the bottom line. And if you can keep this virtuous circle, as we call it, going, then effectively you can keep that whole cycle going for years, if not decades. And there are very good companies out there who've been doing it for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. So fantastic brands built up over decades, sometimes centuries, that if well looked after, will keep delivering this virtuous circle of growth year after year after year. So we've seen it works in aggregate, and we've seen it works at a company-specific level. But it's also the classic way to turn around brands. And I'm going to give you a very quick and simple case study here from Hershey. Hershey in the early 2000s, in the US chocolate market, had started to lose its mojo, I think we'd say. It had basically tried to boost the top line by proliferating the number of products that they sold, releasing limited edition products, seasonal products, new flavors, to the point where actually, for anyone who knows Hershey Kisses, there were 27 different types in the market at the time. A&P to sales had fell, so the core brand equities were under pressure. The CEO was ousted, basically, and Dave West came in late 2006. They had a full review of the business, what should we be doing, and they went back to basics. They reinvested back into the core. 2008, they increased their advertising spend by just over 25%. Funnily enough, the top line responded, as you can see hopefully on the left, very quickly. They didn't stop there. In 2009, they increased their advertising spend by 50%, and the top line accelerated. And in 2010, they increased their advertising spend by over 60%. And of course, the base is getting bigger here, so the numbers are getting ever larger. And funnily enough, the top line accelerated again. And you can see from the right-hand side, hopefully, that although the profit margin did dip for 1 year as they put all that spend in, it very quickly started to rebound. Because as we said, the top line drives faster growth. That delivers profit growth, allowing you to reinvest. Margins have responded and have grown every year since. And in the 5 years since 2008, earnings will have doubled, advertising spends tripled, the share price has gone up threefold, and it's now pretty much thought of as the best-in-class consumer staples company in the world with a valuation to match. So it works in aggregate, it works on a company-specific level, and it works for turnarounds. But I understand that now, and I'm sure all of you understand that, but the investor, the financial community doesn't. And as part of the research report that I wrote, we did a survey of about 200 investors accounting for billions and billions of dollars under management. And we asked them 4 very simple questions. Do you have a good idea of how the industry spends its marketing budget? 73% said no. Remember, this is bankers and fund managers admitting they don't know something. So that's relatively rare. Secondly, do you think companies provide enough information on A&P? 83% say no. Is cutting A&P to protect profitability in a downturn a sensible strategy? 75% say no. And finally, are there any aspects of A&P you don't understand or would like to know more about? A massive 83% of people said yes. So there's an open door there from the industry to connect. Just to emphasize that, I'm going to quickly run through a few of the comments that came up over and over again in this survey. Isn't organic growth just a result of different cycles, not different A&P strategies? You can cut A&P as long as it's temporary, can't you? Isn't it share of voice that's the important thing? And then lastly, but there's no difference between the A and the P, is there? The companies understand it. On the back of the research report we wrote, we had a fantastic email from Heineken who said, quote, "You're totally right on marketing. Shortly, the beer sector will run out of acquisition targets and you cannot cost cut your way to greatness." So the companies understand, and you all understand, but the financial world doesn't. So as part of this, I promised Tim that I'd have a think about how the two worlds could reconnect. And I came down to 3 different parts. Firstly, consistency, and I'll come back to all of these. Secondly, transparency. And then thirdly, measurability. Consistency. These are all the terms that just the European companies use to disclose their advertising spend. Brand equity investment, media spend, A&P, sales and marketing expenses. There's even one that reports marketing and administrative expenses. Consistency will help engage, because when people look at this for the first time, they look at it and they think, I don't really want to get involved in this. It's too difficult, it's too murky. Comparability helps engagement. Second element, transparency. Comes back to that question I asked, do companies provide enough information on A&P? Again, I just looked through the European companies here to see who reports what. There's 3 companies that report A&P geographically. I'm not talking about a country here, I'm talking about whole regions, an A&P number for the whole of Africa. There's 4 companies that give it organically, so adjusted for any foreign exchange movements or any acquisition activity. And there's not a single company that reports brand equity regularly, arguably the most important of all the measurements. Companies are typically very quick to say, well, we don't want to give that information, it's commercially sensitive. But I think it's pretty clear that there's a huge amount of information they could give that wouldn't jeopardize their operations. Certainly giving regional data for continents as big as Asia or Latin America is not going to give their competitors an insight into their business. The other part of transparency is one that might be a little bit controversial because of the people in this room, which is the great share of voice argument. And I went back to the first half of 2009, which was the peak of the financial crisis for the staples companies, to see what they said about marketing spend. And I just looked at the beverage companies and the household and personal care companies, and we can see that they basically all claim to have increased their share of voice. Not only, of course, is that mathematically impossible, but it struck me that it's a fantastic excuse for cutting spend and investors buy it. And I am not a fan of the share of voice argument. And I'm going to give you one example. Take Smirnoff, and if there's a Diageo person in the room, I apologize. Smirnoff probably measures its share of voice against Absolute Vodka, Stolichnaya, Grey Goose. And as long as it's winning the war against those guys, it's doing pretty well. But actually, there's a great piece of research done by Diageo that showed just over 60% of consumers who walk into a pub don't know what they're going to drink until they actually get there. So imagine walking into your local pub. This is mine. And imagine you're deciding what to drink. Well, you might have a vodka, and if you do, you may well choose that Smirnoff. But if you don't choose vodka, they've lost the sale. You may well have a gin and tonic. You might have a rum and coke. You might not even have a spirit. You might have a beer or a wine or a soft drink. Come to that matter, you might not have even got to the pub in the first place because you've only got £10 left in your pocket and you decide to go home and order Domino's pizza. In that case, me gaining share of voice against Grey Goose is absolutely of no use to me whatsoever. So I'm also campaigning slightly to reduce the use of the share of voice phrase. I understand it has its merits in various cases, but we certainly shouldn't be using it as an excuse. The last one I want to talk about is measurability. And if there's one thing that financial people don't understand, it's things that don't have numbers attached to them. And I've got 2 examples here. And again, I'm going to have to apologize if there's anyone from Procter & Gamble in the room, because this is a part of a presentation they gave not too long ago. It's about the Tide Super Bowl ad. It must be nearly a year old now. 150 million paid impressions and a whopping 1.15 billion free impressions in less than 2 days. Now, that strikes me as mightily impressive and an awfully big number, but I don't know what that means. Does that mean the volumes went up on the back of it? Does it mean that market share went up? At least does it mean that brand equity went up? We don't get any of that information. Compare that to SAB Miller, who in a presentation a couple of years ago gave this data, which was, I think, actually an advertising campaign they ran in Tanzania, where the volumes on the back of it jumped by 6.6%, market share up 260 basis points, revenues up, profits up. They even told us where the sales came from, some of it cannibalizing their own business. So if there's numbers attached to it, we can analyze it. If we can analyze it, we can understand it. If you want to connect to the financial world, we need numbers. Finally, just to summarize, there's a message for the people in this room. The first and most important part of it is you've got an absolutely fantastic industry. I can see it. I can see it on a company level. I can see it on an aggregate level. I can see it on brand-specific levels when we get that information. But the financial world as a whole doesn't get that. And if you want to connect to them, I think we need more consistency. Consistency of message will get people thinking about the topic and looking into the topic. Remember, that survey said that we want more information. So please encourage companies, encourage the industry to talk more and to give more information, because there is a willing listener there to absorb that information. And then lastly, that information, it has to be measurable. If it's not numbers, financial people don't understand it. With that, I'm going to wrap up, say thank you very much for inviting me here today, and move on to Sara.
Lovely. Thank you, Jamie. That was just a fantastic, really compelling argument to build on everything that we've heard with both the advertising pays about why this is a fantastic industry. But what we'd like really to move the debate on to now is exactly that point about what do we need to do to change the perception the maths men have of the madmen. I couldn't think of a better qualified panel than I have here to help me do this. So we have Ronan Dunn, who is the CEO of Telefonica in the UK and runs the fabulous O2 brand, as well as being chairman of Tesco Mobile. He's the man that's been encouraging us to all be a bit more dog, which is very fine. And he has 11,000 followers himself on Twitter, though whether they're canine or real, it doesn't tell me in my notes. Secondly, we have Andrew Griffiths, who is the CFO and MD of B-Sky B's commercial businesses. He is a CFO, but he is a CFO who is very, very obviously keen on advertising, one would hope, and also on all things technological. So he is responsible for businesses, new innovative businesses in Sky, including Sky Media, AdSmart, Sky IQ, Sky Business, The Cloud, a very busy man. And finally, we have Amanda Sourry, the chairman of Unilever UK and Ireland. And she's run those fabulous pieces of Unilever since 2010, really at one end of the spectrum, helping to drive the sustainability story for Unilever, and at the other, making 8 million men in the UK and Ireland smell nicer with links, apparently, which I thought was or maybe not smell nicer, depending on your point of view, but that would be another debate. There are many familiar faces I have in the audience who have been uncharacteristically quiet for the ones of you that I know well. So what I'm going to do is get things rolling with a question for each of the panellists. But while we're doing that, I'd love you to think about what you really want to ask the panellists and Jamie, so that we can have some great conversations coming from the floor. But I want to start with you, Ronan, because you obviously spend quite a lot of time as a CEO talking to the maths men. May even be considered a maths man yourself. So how big a part of the conversation is all the things that Jamie was talking around A&P, and some of the things he was talking about, consistency, lack of consistency in terminology, is that part of the problem, or is it something else?
I think it definitely is, and as another accountant on the panel, the first thing to say is, I think great business leaders have to believe in their brands, because, as was demonstrated, most of the value of your business is ultimately in the brand. And we describe the fact that we're a brand who runs a business rather than a business that operates a brand. The challenge, though, is that is all very well, but before you can sell that concept effectively to analysts, you've got to sell it in the boardroom. And as is often discussed in this sector, there's not many of the representatives of the marketing industry who are actually sitting at the boardroom. Not enough CMOs are sitting at the board. So I think as part of this, what we have to build is an integrity within the boardroom, so that CEOs have that confidence and certainty about the metrics that are actually driving their business that relate to brand, so that then when they engage with analysts, they can take the challenge that Jamie rightly put about consistency, transparency. And I think when analysts ask questions about brand, they want to know why you have an amplifier in your numbers so that your CAGR is going to be different from somebody else's. That's what they want. They want to measure everybody against the same metrics around cash flows, around compound annual growth rates. But if you have something that means that your CAGR will be different in one of those, then they want to know about it. And that's where this relationship between sales and A&P comes into its own. But CEOs have to be convinced by their marketing directors, and it has to be on our balanced scorecards in the boardroom before the CEOs will stand up and talk eloquently about it outside. That's
a really good and valid point for us all to bear in mind. Andrew, as a media owner, hearing a story that says we need to spend more money must be music to your ears. But I suppose the question for you is more around your role as a media owner in maximising marketing effectiveness. So is all ad investment equal? Is it just a volume game, or is there something more to this than that?
Look, first of all, I'd echo everything Ronan said, and indeed Jamie. We're a business that's wholly intangible. We're almost to the day 25 years old, and the whole business has been built on essentially a brand. There's no other factor of production that we've owned throughout that period on an enduring basis, so I can only echo that. Look, in terms of as a media owner, I think you just look at it on both sides. As always, there's risk and opportunity. The opportunity here is that the numbers, and we see them every day, and we're a proof point, and many of the most successful brands in the UK are just a day-to-day proof point in their markets of the power of advertising, and the fact that if you want to build and particularly create markets, then you're only going to be able to do that with significant levels of media spend. On the flip side, the risk for us all, and again, Ronan touched on that, is that the boardroom is becoming increasingly accountable. The analyst community is very sophisticated. The level of data in all of our lives, and a lot of the new media, we're a mixed media brand, if you like, a mixture of new, with things like AdSmart and Targeted, and a mixture of old media. And that constantly puts a tension in that relationship. So I think it's up to us as media owners to be doing a better job at equipping all of you with the tools so that you can make that case in the boardroom. My sense is it's not for lack of want, it's for lack of the proof points. And so something like AdSmart, which we can talk about if you want, is hugely measurable. It's a product that really transforms the debate about reconciling inputs and outputs, which as an industry we've just all struggled with, and is the seat of a lot of that frustration, I think. So as an owner, I think we have to take responsibility for a lot of the problem and say, well, whatever piece of media you happen to be an owner in, how do you do a better job for your clients in giving them the tools that we all want, because we want them to go into the boardroom and be able to grow their businesses and open new markets as successfully as they can.
So it's interesting, you talked to consistency, you talked to measurability. The third point was around transparency. And maybe, Amanda, it would just be really interesting to hear your take on this point about disclosing marketing information in a way that's as clear as you disclose capital information, for example.
Okay, so we do disclose A&P spend, we do share marketing information. I think it would be naive in a competitive world, in the case of publicly listed companies, to ignore the fact that once you share something in a presentation, then it's there for all of your competitors to see. So I think that's the obvious point. You might not like it, Jamie, but I think that's a reality. I would take the question a little bit differently, and maybe to build on the prior comments. I do think that that marketeers need to ensure that they are at the heart of the commercial strategies of organizations, and that requires transparency and it requires measurability. And so we're all here to grow great brands and hopefully to create brands which are going to be stronger when we leave them than when we found them. And you have to have metrics that demonstrate that you're able to do that. And so it's great to hear a media owner talk about assisting in ensuring that we are able to get that kind of data, because I think we need to move away from this debate about sort of math men or women versus mad men or women, and say, actually, we've got to bring these things together. And in many ways, there's never been a better time to be a marketeer because of the availability of data and real-time analytics to drive business decision-making.
Yeah. So you've heard 3 starter questions and 3 really interesting points of view, building and challenging some of the things Jamie said. Who's going to be brave enough? And I'm a bit blinded by lights, so but hands up for who's brave enough for the first question. She says, peering. Can't surely all be silent. That's very surprising. I can see a hand anyway. Is it Tim? Yes, I recognise the hand.
Thank you. So my question is, following on from your comment about whether marketeers are close to the business strategy, do you think they are close to the business strategy within their organisations?
Should we start with Amanda? I think that's one of the things that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I think we're here to have an overall conversation rather than necessarily to comment on any individual company. But I think the opportunity exists now for marketeers to ensure that they're clear about what they're striving to do with brands, to be transparent within the organisation as to what the metrics of that success are, and to ensure that they're demonstrating how that is turned into commercial reality. And I say that as someone whose background is in marketing.
What about you, Ronan?
Certainly in our business, it's very simple. The marketing director, A, is on the board, and B, owns the P&L. Not the brand spend, they own the P&L. We have a very simple philosophy. It only works when it all works. So you have to put all of these pieces together and make sure that the brand sits at the heart, well, more particularly, customer insight sits at the heart of your business, supported by an effective brand to engage your customers with the innovation that you're developing in your space. And I think the key thing, and a couple of people have touched on it, is I think a lot of the time people confuse in brand between what is effectively the old-fashioned battle of taking a few points of market share. It's about share of wallet. It's about building categories. All of our growth is going to come from building new. Yes, we have to sustain what we have as the basis for building the new, but if it's simply a case of stealing points of share from everyone else, all you simply do is racing to the bottom. So I think in that context, you also have to say that your brand, your innovation, your biz dev, all of those things need to be much more aligned than perhaps was the case in the past.
And from your perspective, is brand just an external thing, manifesting itself to customers?
Well, I kind of alluded to it at the start. I personally have a very clear philosophy on this. Is we have the luxury, although our parent company is Telefonica and the legal entity is called Telefonica UK, you know, I still say to people, if my job title says CEO Telefonica UK, O2. And the reason is because that's the business. It's the brand, it's the thing that our people come to work for every single day. So we have the luxury of one overarching and aligning belief in a set of values that are the same that we offer out to customers as we do to staff. And when we were talking before we came on, I think one of the often unstated powers of brand in the intangible value is employee engagement, and the power of alignment to the brand and its values can be an enormous driver in differentiation, in my view, particularly in a service business, where at the end of the day, our brand is actually defined by the people who pick up the phone or stand in front of you in a retail store every day. That's the reality of our brand, and therefore their engagement with the brand agenda and the values is hugely important.
Oh, that's a fascinating way of looking at intangible asset, because not only is the advertising sometimes disguised, but so is that. What about other questions?
Can I just shake it up a bit? I mean, I think my business is pretty similar to Ronan's. And let's be provocative. I think if as a brand, you don't actually know your customers, if you've allowed yourself to be disintermediated and don't have a super clear, granular view about who your customers are, what media they're consuming, what other categories they're spending a lot of time on, you want to be looking for your next career move. Because I think the world in every sector is being eaten up by companies who've got that access to data, who are able to make that direct connection to the customers, whether it's on social media or whether it's just the abundance of being able to measure what your customers are doing and what other factors they're consuming. It's why O2 is enormously successful. I think it's why Sky is successful and why marketing is at the heart of our business, because we have a one-on-one customer relationship. It's real time, it's every single day. And I think increasingly, if you look at the new competitive set, which tend to be businesses that have grown in new media, grown up with digital technologies, that's the way the world is going.
And it's a very different take then on what insight means from the way we used to think about it traditionally when you harness data in that way.
It has to be super granular, or it's no longer insight, because somebody out there is going to have more granularity than you have. And if you don't, in the long term, that's no basis from which to compete.
Yeah. I can see a hand up there, and then we'll move frontwards.
Hello, I'm Janet Hull. I work at the IPA. A question for Jamie. Jamie, actually, we equally, at the same time as Jeremy, picked up on your report in 2010. And I'm glad to say that in that report, quite a lot of IPA information is referenced. At the same time, we began to try and pick up on your points and did develop a publication called KPIs for Marketing Reporting, a framework for marketing disclosure. We researched it really carefully, and it was our amateur attempt to try and bridge the gap that you described there between your world and our world. And what I would like to ask is, would this be a good thing for us to reopen debate about? It's already 2 to 3 years old. It obviously needs updating. With your help, we could make fantastic strides, I think. The other point I wanted to raise is that what we had difficulty doing was working out what channel of communication to open to make sure that the equity analyst community could understand our business better. We looked at getting marketing directors in front of equity analysts. We found it really difficult because they were normally barred by the finance director and the CEO. We then created our own dialogue with analysts, and as advertising agencies, we went to talk to the city. We felt as though we were going behind the back of our clients and talked to the Marketing Society about opening up the debate together. It wasn't the perfect solution, but we're really keen to do it, and what we need help to understand is how to do it well. So what I'd like to propose is that we could take forward this debate following the conference and find a way we could work with you to develop the appropriate channels. We have something in writing we could send to you, and we can build on it.
Okay, well, that sounds like quite a
like an offer
detailed
a
question to pick up afterwards. But the overarching question around, how do we build that bridge? What are the channels is the interesting one to do the short answer on.
No, I think it was, points that are very well made and very well put. And it comes back, I suppose, that the first element of that you mentioned comes back to the point I made about consistency. And that really is the crux of it. To engage the financial community, you need to remove the confusion. And that is definitely the consistency part of the debate. And that is one that I think the advertising world, the marketing world, and the corporate world need to have together to come up with what the right set of KPIs are that can give more information without putting commercially sensitive information on the table, as Amanda alluded to. So that's a debate that I think has to be done by those two parts of the industries. In terms of getting in front of the financial world, I think you hit the nail on the head by saying every time you tried, the CFO's got in the way. It's ironic, actually, because the CEOs or the very senior people in most of the consumer staples companies I cover tend to be marketers or salespeople. There's not actually that many financial people who are at the very top. So it's an audience that should be on side and an audience that should understand the issues. And I think, again, that the same issue comes back to this consistency, that as long as you can find some way of expressing information that the finance department are not going to worry about, that engagement will happen, because the finance community will suddenly get interested, and you won't need to go to them, they'll come to you.
I would agree with that. I think the issue is not going to be, I'm a finance director, so I sit on both sides of this debate. Look, I think the issue is not fundamentally disclosure. I think the issue is fundamentally measurement and developing a conviction by the finance director, by the sales and marketing function, about a proper measurement of the return on cost invested. In my experience, finance directors have no issue at all with disclosing, for example, in retail, sales per square foot. Yeah? No one mandates that. No one's gone and lobbied or agitated for that. It's become a common currency because it's relatively easy to measure and it's relatively transparent. And people develop a conviction and confidence. And no one particularly, people like talking about the business. People like getting out there, look, we're doing a great job. This is, these are our inputs. This is how we add value, and this is the outputs that you get. The issue to me still comes back to fundamentally what our measurement is. We've got some great measurement. My colleagues in the marketing department at Sky are super good at measuring the return on investment. There's still a debate about the time frame over that. Do we measure on a 3-month basis? Is it the direct sales, or is it an intangible element in that? And we've developed and are developing all the time better measurement. We're on a real quest. And it is, again, the data that's unlocked that. And we have the advantage of being a one-on-one company. So if we spend £1 of marketing and we add one customer, both parts of that are very transparent and visible. And certainly in FMCG, there isn't yet that one-on-one relationship. My sense is over time that will improve.
I think there was another question down at the very front. There's a microphone coming down so the people at the very back can hear. Thank you.
Peter Simmons, CEO and CFO of Doc Mailer. Question for Jamie, really. In your chart showing the correlation between A&P spend and sales growth, you conveniently put a 12-month lag in to show the correlation. Isn't one of the problems that the investment community actually aren't very happy with that 12-month lag? They actually want the sales growth to happen in the same year that you make the increased ad spend.
It's a very good point, actually, and I nearly interrupted in the last question, or the last but one question about that, about the marketers driving strategy, and I think one of the important elements that the finance world can give to try and bridge that gap is to take a longer-term view of life, because things like quarterly reporting, et cetera, are not useful to anyone with a sensible time horizon. In our firm, when we look at investments, we look at them a minimum of 3 years, but the ideal investment for us is one that we never, ever sell. So I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be, what the finance community can do to try and bridge that gap is to try and take a longer-term view, to understand that payoff isn't necessarily immediate. And then I think the two parties can get much closer together, because as we've shown, it certainly pays off, but the Coca-Colas, the Unilevers, the Colgates of this world, they weren't built with 1-year lags. They were built over 50, 60, 70, 100 years, and that's why they're such great businesses now.
I think, Amanda, it would be great as the representative of the oldest company on the sofa. What's your view on horizons and how Unilever manages that from your perspective?
So I think we've talked about defining metrics quite a few times already in this morning's session, and I think that part of defining metrics has also got to be about over what time horizon we're looking at, and that needs to be part of the same transparency that we discuss marketing investment in a boardroom. So I don't think it's any different from that. I will say that in my experience, it's very rare to not get a short-term as well as a long-term return on investment. There are obviously different curves on that, and you get benefit over time of consistency, etc. But I would certainly always be a bit concerned on any marketing investment that wasn't returning both short and longer term.
I think we have probably got, sorry, it's hard to see with the lights and the flashing numbers, but I think we've got time for one good more question in the middle there. We can see a stripy shirt, I think.
Mark from TNT Post. I think we've seen some of this discussion played out quite interestingly recently with the IPO on Facebook, which obviously Facebook got the marketing community incredibly excited, all that reach and everything else, and then the financial community took a look at it arguably and said, not so sure, and we know what happened. And arguably they're fighting back, so fair enough. But, I mean, where does this debate lead on the topic of innovation? Because marketeers, probably by their nature, are always going to want to innovate and do something new. That may be detrimental. It's certainly in the short term to the bottom line sort of performance, but obviously omelettes and breaking eggs, I guess. So what's the panel's view on that one?
Andrew, would you like to kick off and then maybe Ronan?
Yeah, sure. Well, sure. Is the question about innovation in where you deploy your marketing spend?
Yeah,
or innovation within them?
To some degree, absolutely. I mean, how do you innovate while keeping performance on track? Maybe Facebook's not the best example because perhaps it hasn't proved itself in the longer term or the shorter term yet. But I think there's a challenge there about the metrics perhaps touching on the previous point around the time frame for results, and innovation unlikely to be able to show that in the short term.
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer in forcing in inefficiency. So I would be segregating a pool of money to be deliberately inefficient, because that's where serendipity happens. That's where you get innovation. So, no one's going to have the luxury of being able to experiment when they're so KPI'd with the whole of their marketing spend. But if you continue to do that, the only thing that will happen is you continue to do what you do now. So for me, whether it's an allocation of employee time, which some of the most innovative companies do, or whether it's actually taking, when we take our product development, we take a small piece of that and we say, that's not KPI'd, there is no return expected on that, that's for serendipity and real innovation to happen, that's much more blue sky than you'll ever drive through any sort of tracking and measurement. So much as though I think that the world will go to a one-on-one, fully tracked, data-driven dimension, as you rotate in that direction, the yin to the yang is that you've also got to put aside some specific time, resources to do the pure innovation from which great insight comes. So that would be my answer as to how you reconcile those two things.
And what about you, Ronan?
I think the example on Facebook is an interesting one. Is the financial community's exam question was, can Facebook migrate its advertising capability from the desktop to mobile? In some respects, that's exactly the same exam question that all of you have, and all of us have, because the reality of the engagement with the customer is moving and the platforms through which they engage. So, as Andrew said, building on that is we have to be able to innovate, but the track on all of this is, I go back to, you have to be prepared to take some risk dollars there, I have no doubt. But the track on all of this is, if you start always with the customer and the customer insight, you're going to be on the track, because guess what? We're responding to customers' change behavior. Don't be surprised, therefore, that we need to change the way we engage, because they are already changing the way they engage with us.
Jamie, it'd be lovely for you to have the last word, as well as the first.
Well, it's an interesting question, because I don't think about innovation and marketing or advertising as different things, actually. As far as I'm concerned, it's fuel for brands. Brands need to innovate, and that's a core part of it. And Ronan mentioned something before about category growth. It's a topic I was thinking about going into and didn't in the end. When we talk about market share and we talk about share of voice, but actually just as important is the category growth. And certainly in my experience in FMCG, category growth tends to come from innovation. Not always, but usually innovation. And it's that innovation which then drives marketing, advertising to drive the growth of the market and bring in new entrants who want a piece of that pie. And the new entrants bring more investment and the category develops. You take a very crude example in the cider category, the fantastic innovation which was the ice cube. All of a sudden, these guys from C&C realized that cider tastes nice if it was cold. You bring the ice cube to it, and all of a sudden, people want to drink it. And then, because the category had started growing for the first time in 20 years, everybody wanted to get involved in cider. So Heineken invests, and SAB Miller invests. And all that marketing, all that advertising, and all that innovation builds and builds until suddenly you've got a fantastic, vibrant category that, quite frankly, hadn't moved for 20 years. So from my side of the fence, innovation is just more fuel for market growth and long-term brand value.
Thank you. With that, I'm afraid we need to wrap up, that we could talk for a very long time. I mean, I, for one, just feel thoroughly more on the front foot for the conversation. So thank you to all of you, and over to Tim. You can go now.